I had driven hundreds, maybe thousands of miles in the dead of night, transporting all sorts of people to places they didn't necessarily want to go. But nothing could have prepared me for the ride I took last night. What started as an ordinary fare turned into a nightmare, one that still haunts me. A passenger, a man with hollow eyes and a strange request, asked to be driven to a cemetery that didn't exist. You might be thinking, that's impossible. There's no way that could happen. But trust me, by the end of this story, you'll realize that some things are best left unexplained. Before we dive into this terrifying tale, I want you to do me a quick favor.
If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you don't want to miss the wild, unsettling stories that are coming your way. For those of you who love a good mystery, who crave the strange and the unknown, you're in the right
place. Now back to the story. This one is going to leave you questioning everything you think you know about reality. It was 2 a.m., the hour when the world feels empty, when the streets are quiet and the city is asleep. I had just picked up a fare, an older man dressed in a weathered jacket and a hood that shaded most of his face. He gave me a slight nod as he got in, the faintest of smiles playing on his lips. He wasn't in a hurry. There was no sense of urgency in his demeanor. But then he spoke the words that would set the entire night into motion. He wanted me to take him to a cemetery, Hollow Oaks Cemetery. My mind froze for a second. I had never heard of it. I asked him where it was, but the directions he gave me were vague, as if he was only half there. He mentioned something about it being tucked away outside of town, past the woods. It wasn't unusual to take people to cemeteries. In fact, I'd been to nearly every burial ground in the area. But Hollow Oaks Cemetery? That was new to me. Still, I didn't think much of it. People ask for weird places all the time. I chalked it up to another odd request. I started the car and began heading down the dark, winding roads, my headlights the only thing cutting through the dense night. As we drove, I tried to make small talk, but the man barely responded. His voice was soft, detached. He didn't seem interested in anything I had to say. I noticed he was staring out of the window, his gaze distant, almost as if he wasn't really there. The more I drove, the more the road seemed unfamiliar. I had been down these paths countless times, but now everything felt off. The streets that should have been well lit were dim, and the area seemed eerily silent. I checked the GPS, but it wasn't showing anything. The map was blank, like the place didn't even exist. I glanced at the man, hoping for some sort of clarification. He told me to keep going, reassuring me that we were getting closer. But the road, the woods, the shadows, it all started to blur together in a way that made me uneasy. As I pressed forward, the air in the car seemed to thicken. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The man's body language was strange. He had stopped looking out the window and was now staring straight ahead, gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He looked uncomfortable, anxious even. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was waiting for something. I could sense the change in the atmosphere, a palpable tension hanging in the air. Then, out of nowhere, he told me to stop. We were still, in the middle of nowhere, but he insisted. He had the same empty, urgent look in his eyes, like he knew something I didn't. I pulled over, unsure of what was going on. He got out of the car without a word and walked toward the woods. The silence was deafening. He didn't look back at me once, just walked straight ahead. I sat in the car, paralyzed with indecision. Was I supposed to follow him? My curiosity got the best of me. I switched off the engine and stepped out, my feet crunching on the gravel as I walked toward the woods, my eyes scanning the dark for any sign of a cemetery. I reached the edge of the woods, but there was nothing. No sign of a cemetery, no markers, no graves, nothing but trees and an endless stretch of darkness. My heart was pounding, a knot forming in my stomach. I called out to the man, but there was no response. I walked further into the woods, hoping to find him, but I couldn't see anything. It was as if the entire place had swallowed him whole. I quickly turned back toward the cab, but when I reached it, the man was gone. No trace of him. No footprints, no sign that he had ever been there. I stood there for a long moment trying to make sense of it all. What had just happened? Had I imagined the whole thing? I checked the back seat of the cab hoping to find some clue, but everything was as it should be, except for the unsettling emptiness that now filled the car. I got back in and drove away, but the roads felt unfamiliar. The streets I knew so well seemed different now, as if I had driven into a place that didn't belong in the real world. When I finally returned to the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind. I had just driven through a nightmare, and now it was following me. I parked the cab and took a deep breath, hoping that whatever happened wasn't as bad as it seemed. But then, my phone buzzed. I opened a news article, and my stomach dropped. Hollow Oak Cemetery, the one the man had asked for, wasn't just some forgotten place. It didn't exist at all. Not anymore. It had been abandoned for over a century, lost to time. Yet somehow, I had driven this man to a place that wasn't supposed to be real. And now, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had changed me somehow. But I didn't have the answers, and I wasn't sure I wanted them. I couldn't get the man's request out of my head. Hollow Oak Cemetery? It didn't make sense. I had driven that stretch of road 100 times, and I'd never once heard of a cemetery by that name. It wasn't just strange, it was unsettling. How could something like that just disappear? And why had the man chosen to go there of all places? Something felt wrong, deep in my bones, like the whole encounter was designed to mess with my mind. The more I thought about it, the more questions popped up. I tried to shake off the feeling that there was something supernatural at play, but the doubts lingered. I reached for my phone, thinking maybe there was some explanation, something I missed. Maybe it was an old cemetery that had been closed for years, or maybe the man had been mistaken. But no, nothing. I searched for Hollow Oak Cemetery, but the results were all blank. No maps, no articles, no news. Just a dead end. I tried reaching out to my fellow drivers, asking if anyone had heard of this place. No one knew anything about it. They just laughed it off, calling it one of those weird stories you get when you work the night shift. But something about this felt different. This wasn't just a random tale. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't explain. Maybe I was overthinking it, but I couldn't shake the image of the man, his cold stare, and his eerie calm, as he told me exactly where to go. The next night, I drove my usual route, but something had changed. The roads felt different, like they had shifted while I wasn't looking. I passed by the familiar street signs, the ones I knew like the back of my hand, but they seemed distorted, out of place. The usual landmarks were gone. It was like driving through a dream, a nightmare where the world didn't quite fit. I wondered if I was losing my grip on reality, but then I remembered that I wasn't the only one who had been to that cemetery. My curiosity gnawed at me. I found myself thinking back to that night, to the woods, to the place where the man had walked off into the darkness. I had never seen anything like it before. It wasn't just a forgotten road or a remote location. It was something else. It was like a thin veil between worlds had been lifted for just a moment. I couldn't explain it, but I felt that I had crossed into something beyond the ordinary, into something that didn't follow the rules of the world I knew. I decided to go back. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I had to know if there was something more to the cemetery, or if I had simply been tricked by my own mind. So I got in the cab and started driving again. The night felt thicker this time, like I was being drawn into something I didn't fully understand. My headlights cut through the dark, but the road seemed to stretch on forever, each turn more uncertain than the last. I was getting closer to the woods again, the place where the man had vanished. But this time, I wasn't sure I wanted to find him. As I approached the area, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. The trees loomed over me, casting long, twisted shadows across the road. The air grew heavier, colder, as if the night itself was closing in around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I slowed the car, almost hesitant to continue, but something inside me pushed me forward. I had to know. I had to see if this cemetery existed, if it was real, or if I was simply losing my mind. Drove further, my eyes scanning the road for any sign of the man, any hint of the cemetery, But there was nothing. Just more trees, more darkness, stretching endlessly in front of me. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I was alone in this place, and the feeling was suffocating. The roads I had once known so well now felt alien, as though they no longer belonged to this world. I had entered a realm I didn't understand, and I had no idea how to escape it. I reached the spot where the man had disappeared, but as I looked around, all I saw were shadows. I stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at my skin. I stood there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, but the silence was deafening. It was as if time itself had stopped. There was no wind, no sound, nothing but the eerie stillness of the woods. I took a few tentative steps forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Where was the cemetery? Where was the man? Then, something caught my eye. A small, weathered sign, barely visible through the trees. It was almost as if it had been placed there just for me to see, a silent invitation to step deeper into the unknown. I moved closer, my pulse racing as I read the words on the sign. Hollow Oaks Cemetery. I froze. This couldn't be real. It wasn't supposed to be here. And yet, there it was, standing in front of me, as if it had always been there, waiting for someone to find it. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the weathered sign. My breath came out in short bursts, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Hollow Oaks Cemetery. The words seemed to mock me, like some twisted joke I wasn't in on. I had driven this road countless times, and never once had I seen anything that even remotely resembled a cemetery. But there it was, right in front of me, hidden in the shadows of the trees. I took a hesitant step forward, my feet heavy, as if the ground itself was resisting my movement. The trees around me seemed to grow thicker, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes, like dark hands reaching out to pull me deeper into the forest. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. The air had grown still, unnervingly so, and I could taste the dampness of the forest on my tongue. It was as though the world had fallen silent, all the noises of the night swallowed by the darkness. I looked around, trying to find something familiar, something that made sense, but there was nothing. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself and took another step toward the cemetery. The ground was uneven, the dirt soft beneath my shoes. Every step I took felt like a step further from reality. The trees grew even denser, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. I could barely see anything beyond the faint glow of my car's headlights, and that too seemed to be swallowed by the night. I reached out to touch the sign, hoping it would ground me, but the moment my fingers brushed against it, a chill ran down my spine. The sign was old, its wood splintered and rotting, but the letters were still clear. Hollow Oaks Cemetery. The words echoed in my mind, each one sounding more and more like a warning. Why had no one ever spoken of this place? If it had been here all along, how could it be so hidden? There had to be an explanation, something that tied it to the world I knew. But no matter how hard I tried, nothing made sense. I glanced around, again, my eyes searching for any sign of the man who had directed me here, but he was nowhere to be seen. I stood at the edge of the cemetery now, the entrance looming before me like an invitation to step into a place where time no longer held sway. The cemetery was hidden deep within the trees, its gravestones barely visible through the thick underbrush. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. The sense of dread had grown, but so had my curiosity. I had to know. I had to see what lay within this forgotten place. Slowly, I made my way into the cemetery, the ground soft beneath my feet as I stepped carefully over roots and fallen leaves. The air grew colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to fend off the chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The path was barely visible, the graves partially obscured by overgrowth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every step I took seemed to echo in the quiet, each footfall amplifying the silence that surrounded me. As I moved deeper into the cemetery, the sense of unease grew stronger. I could feel the weight of the air pressing down on me, heavy with something I couldn't name. The gravestones were weathered, their inscriptions faded and worn, and some were so old that they seemed to have been forgotten by time itself. I paused in front of one particularly worn grave, its stone cracked and chipped. The name was barely legible, but something about it caught my attention. The letters were blurred, but I could make out enough to see that it was a name I recognized. From somewhere, someone I had seen before. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move on. The cemetery seemed to stretch on endlessly, each grave more decrepit than the last. I couldn't help but wonder who had been buried here, and why they had been left to rot in this forsaken place. The longer I stayed, the more I felt as though I was trespassing in a world that didn't belong to me. I needed to leave, but something held me there, as if the cemetery itself was pulling me deeper into its embrace. As I continued walking, I came across a small chapel in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the dark sky. It was nothing more than a crumbling structure, but it stood tall against the decay around it, as if guarding the secrets of the cemetery. My curiosity got the better of me, and I walked toward it, my footsteps quickening as I neared. The door to the chapel was ajar, creaking in the wind. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. Inside, the chapel was cold and dark, the air thick with dust and neglect. The pews were rotted, some of them completely collapsed, and the altar was covered in a thick layer of grime. But it wasn't the state of the chapel that unsettled me. It was the feeling that something was watching me, something hidden in the shadows, waiting. My breath quickened as I moved further into the chapel, my eyes scanning the room. There, at the far end, near the altar, was a figure. A shape I could barely make out, but its presence was unmistakable. I froze, staring at the shape, my heart pounding in my chest. It was still, motionless, but I could feel its gaze on me. It was as if it were waiting for me to make a move, daring me to step closer. The air grew colder still, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as though the chapel had become a tomb and I was its final occupant. I could feel the darkness in the chapel pressing against me, each moment stretching longer as I stood frozen in place. The figure, though barely discernible in the shadowed corner of the room, seemed to shift just slightly with the wind that crept through the cracks in the old building. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something more sinister, but the longer I stared, the more I felt as though it wasn't entirely human. The air was thick with a cold, unnatural presence, like the room itself was holding its breath. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. Every instinct screamed for me to leave, to escape this place. But something, a pull, a force, kept me rooted in place. The figure remained motionless, its shape barely outlined in the faint moonlight that filtered through the broken windows. It was then that I noticed something that sent a wave of dread through me. There was a faint, low whisper coming from the figure, so soft that it barely registered. It was a murmur, but unmistakably distinct. I took a tentative step forward, my heart hammering in my chest, and the whisper grew slightly louder, more intelligible. It was not words I could understand, but it felt like a chant, like something ancient being spoken in a language that no one had spoken for centuries. My skin crawled as the air around me grew heavier, thick with an oppressive force that seemed to invade every part of my body. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for a brief second I thought I could hear my own pulse echoing in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. The figure didn't move, not even an inch, yet I felt its presence shift, as if it were slowly turning its gaze towards me. I couldn't see its face, but somehow I felt like it was staring directly into my soul. Panic started to rise within me, my breath shallow and ragged. Every part of my body screamed at me to flee, to get out of this suffocating darkness, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shape. There was something in the way it stood there, so still, yet so powerful, that it felt as if the entire room was somehow focused on me. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. A cold silence settled in, and I thought for a moment that I might be able to breathe again. But then, the ground beneath me seemed to groan. a low rumble that vibrated through the chapel like a deep, unsettling hum. The walls seemed to close in around me, the very structure of the building bending, as if it were alive, pressing closer, and I could swear I felt the weight of something immense on my chest. My pulse quickened, and for the first time I found the strength to move, my legs shaky as I backed away slowly from the figure. But just as I thought I could escape, something grabbed my attention from the corner of my eye. The pews, the ones I had earlier thought were broken and empty, began to shift. It was almost imperceptible at first, a slight creak of wood, a slow shift as if something beneath them was moving, but then it became more pronounced. The pews began to bend and sway as if they were alive themselves, their wooden frames creaking under the weight of some unseen force. I could barely make sense of what I was seeing, what was happening. My mind raced, trying to process what was unfolding in front of me. The chapel had become something else, something beyond the decaying building it had appeared to be. It was as if the space itself had turned against me, twisting into something unnatural. I could no longer trust the ground beneath me, nor the walls around me. Every crack and crevice seemed to be a potential doorway to another world, a world where the dead had come to life and were watching me, waiting. I tried to take a step back, but my feet were still glued to the floor. My body refused to obey my commands. Every inch of me felt like it was sinking into the earth, as if the chapel itself were trying to pull me down into its depths. I looked again at the figure. It had not moved, but the air around it had thickened. It was no longer a silent observer. It was an active participant in the strange, terrifying ritual that seemed to be taking place. I had never felt so small, so insignificant, like a single speck of dust in the presence of something far beyond my comprehension. A cold wind suddenly swept through the room, sending a chill deep into my bones. I shivered involuntarily, and in that instant, I thought I saw the figure move. It was so slight that I could have imagined it, but there was a shift in the shadow, a subtle change that made my stomach churn with unease. The sound of something scraping across the floor echoed in my ears, and I turned, my eyes darting around in desperation, searching for an escape that seemed to be closing off at every turn. I couldn't take it anymore. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I wrenched myself away from the spot where I had been frozen, stumbling backward, desperate to break free of the chapel. My foot hit a fallen pew, sending it crashing to the floor with a deafening noise that shattered the oppressive silence. For a brief moment, I thought I saw the figure move toward me, but my eyes couldn't focus on it long enough to be sure. I didn't care anymore. I turned and ran, ignoring the twisting path that led me out of the chapel and into the dark, choking air outside. As I stumbled back to my car, I realized I hadn't just left the chapel. I had left the cemetery, and in doing so, I had crossed a line. There was something about that place, something that had followed me out, lurking just beyond the reach of the light. My mind screamed at me to leave, to never return, but deep down, I knew that wasn't an option anymore. Something had been awakened that night, something I had no understanding of, and it wasn't done with me yet. The following days blurred together as I tried to piece together what had happened that night. It was as if the world had shifted somehow, like a layer of reality had peeled back, revealing something darker, something ancient. I couldn't escape. The images, the dark figure in the chapel, the unsettling feeling of being watched, the creeping sensation that I had been part of something far more dangerous than I had realized. My mind was fixated on that cemetery that didn't exist, or at least not in the way it was supposed to. Every time I tried to tell myself it was just a bad dream, I could feel that gnawing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach, like I had narrowly escaped something far worse. I started avoiding certain parts of town, driving by in a hurry, pretending that nothing had changed. But every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of the old cemetery from the corner of my eye. It was never in the right place, never quite where it should have been. It was always just a little too far, just outside the range of my vision, like a shadow lurking on the edge of reality. There was no way to ignore it. The more I tried to push it out of my mind, the stronger it became, like a ghost following me, refusing to let me go. One afternoon, as I was sitting in a coffee shop, trying to focus on the mundane details of life, I overheard a conversation at a nearby table. Two men, who looked like they had seen more than their fair share of trouble, were discussing something in hushed tones. At first I didn't pay much attention, but then I heard a word that caught my ear. Cemetery. I froze, straining to hear. They were talking about the same place, the place I had been to. I could feel my pulse quicken, a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. The conversation had shifted to something else, but I couldn't let it go. I had to know more. I leaned in, trying not to make it obvious that I was eavesdropping. One of the men was speaking now, telling the other about a place deep in the woods, a place that had been long forgotten by the town. The cemetery wasn't part of any map, but it was there, and people who went searching for it, well, they didn't come back. At least, not in the same way. There were rumors of strange happenings around it, stories passed down through generations of disappearances and eerie encounters. The man was telling his friend that it was cursed, that the dead there didn't rest peacefully, that they had a purpose. My heart sank as I listened, knowing that what they were describing was no different than what I had seen. I left the coffee shop with a sinking feeling, the weight of their words pressing down on me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that what I had experienced wasn't a random encounter. The cemetery, the figure, the whispers, it all made sense now. It wasn't just a one-time thing. I had been drawn into something much bigger, something that had been lurking beneath the surface of this quiet town for centuries. I had stumbled into a story far older than I had realized, and now it was pulling me back. I tried to dismiss the thought, but the nagging feeling refused to leave me. That night, I found myself driving again, the road ahead dark and empty. My headlights cut through the fog, the town's outline barely visible against the night sky. I passed by the familiar roads, the landmarks that felt comforting in their consistency, but the further I went, the more I felt a pull toward the unknown. It was as if the cemetery was calling me, drawing me back to finish what I had started. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I fought the urge to turn down the road that led to the woods. As I approached the edge of town, the familiar landmarks began to blur. The streets became narrower, the houses more spaced out, until I was driving through an area I hadn't been through in years. The trees seemed to close in on me, their branches twisting and contorting into shapes that seemed almost human. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the darkness had eyes watching me from the shadows. My thoughts raced, but I couldn't stop myself. Something was pushing me forward, urging me to follow the path that would lead me to the cemetery. Eventually, the road narrowed further, and I found myself at the edge of a clearing. The headlights of my car illuminated something ahead, an old, decaying iron gate, its bars twisted and rusted with age. Beyond the gate, the cemetery stretched out in the distance, but it was nothing like I had seen before. The graves were unmarked, the tombstones broken and crumbling. The air itself seemed to hang heavy with the stench of decay, as though the earth itself was rotting, but there was something else, something more unsettling. The silence. It was absolute, unnatural. I couldn't hear the sound of the wind, the rustle of leaves, or even my own breathing. It was as if the world had ceased to exist outside of that place. I parked the car, the engine idling as I stared at the cemetery, trying to make sense of it. This was the place, but it didn't look like any cemetery I had ever seen, and there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. The shadows within it seemed to move of their own accord, and the air was thick with a sense of impending doom. I wasn't sure if I should get out of the car or turn around and leave, but I knew deep down that I couldn't leave. Not yet. Something was calling me, pulling me toward the gate. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't resist. It was like a magnetic force, an invisible thread that tugged at my very soul, urging me to walk deeper into the darkness. I opened the car door and stepped out, my feet dragging as if weighed down by the very earth beneath me. With each step I took toward the cemetery, the air grew colder, and the silence deepened. I was no longer just an observer. I was part of it now, part of the twisted story that had been unfolding all along. And then, just as I reached the gate, something moved in the corner of my vision, a figure shrouded in darkness standing just beyond the trees. My heart raced and I froze in place. There was no sound, no movement, but the figure was unmistakable. It was watching me, waiting for me to take that final step. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and I knew with a sudden clarity that the moment I crossed into that cemetery, there would be no turning back. I hesitated at the gate, my feet rooted to the spot as I stared at the figure standing motionless in the trees. It felt as though the very air had thickened, pressing against me from all sides. The dark figure, tall, almost unnaturally so, remained, still, its features hidden by the deep shadows cast by the moonless sky. The temperature seemed to drop even further, the cold creeping into my bones. I swallowed hard, struggling to steady my breath, but it was no use. There was a pull, an invisible force drawing me forward. I couldn't deny it any longer. I had to go in. Something whispered to me from the depths of the cemetery, a voice barely audible but unmistakable. It wasn't a voice I could hear with my ears. It was a sensation, a presence that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of my being. It beckoned me, its call both soothing and terrifying, like a lullaby sung in a forgotten language. I knew I couldn't turn back now. The cemetery wasn't just a place, it was a presence, alive with history and secrets. It had been waiting, for me, and I had been drawn to it long before this night. With each step I took toward the gate, the darkness seemed to deepen. The cemetery ahead stretched out like a vast, desolate wasteland, its gravestones broken and jagged, as though the earth itself had cracked open and expelled its dead. But what struck me most was the oppressive silence. No birds, no insects, no wind. It was as though the world had been completely swallowed up by this place. I couldn't even hear my own heartbeat, which only amplified the sense of isolation. I was alone here, more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The ground beneath my feet was soft, spongy, as though it had absorbed centuries of secrets and sorrows. The overgrown grass clung to my shoes, tugging at them as I moved forward. I could feel the weight of the place pressing on me, as if the cemetery itself was alive, watching me, waiting for something. And then, I saw it. The chapel. It was small and decayed, nestled in the farthest corner of the graveyard, barely visible through the thick trees. It seemed out of place, its dark silhouette looming like a specter. It was clear this chapel hadn't been used in years, maybe even centuries. But there was something about it that called to me, just like everything else in this cursed place. My legs moved of their own accord, pulling me toward the chapel as though some unseen hand was guiding me. I couldn't resist. My heart raced in my chest and my mind screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't. There was a dark allure to this place, something that felt both dangerous and inevitable. As I reached the chapel, I noticed that the door stood ajar, as though someone had been waiting for me, or perhaps it had always been open, waiting for the next unwitting soul to wander into its grasp. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside, my footfall muffled by the thick dust on the floor. The air inside was musty, stale, and thick with the scent of decay. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I saw rows of pews, long forgotten and covered in layers of dust. The walls were adorned with old faded paintings, images of saints and angels, their faces worn with time, their features barely visible beneath the grime. But what struck me most was the altar at the far end of the chapel. It was old too, but it looked different. It was almost as if it had been preserved, untouched by the passage of time, its surface gleaming faintly in the darkness. I took a tentative step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. As I moved closer to the altar, I saw something etched into the stone, a symbol. It was intricate, unlike anything I had ever seen, and it seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural energy. The symbol felt familiar, like something I had seen in a dream, or perhaps something I had always known, buried deep in my subconscious. A shiver ran down my spine as I reached out to touch it, my fingers grazing the cold stone. The moment I made contact, the air around me seemed to shift. The chapel groaned, as though it was coming to life, and I heard a low, guttural sound rising from somewhere deep beneath the earth. I pulled my hand back quickly, my mind reeling from the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The sense of unease that had been creeping up on me now turned into pure terror. I was no longer alone. I could feel the presence in the chapel with me, something ancient and malevolent, watching, waiting. The whispers grew louder, rising into a cacophony that echoed in my skull. I staggered back, my mind spinning, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the altar. Something was calling me, demanding that I approach, that I understand the meaning behind the symbol. I turned to leave, but my legs refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in the grip of whatever force had taken hold of me. The figure outside the chapel was gone, and in its place stood another shape. A tall, shadowy figure that filled the doorway, blocking my escape. It was impossibly still, its form indistinct, like smoke or shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were there, boring into my soul, stripping away everything that made me human. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. This place, this cursed cemetery, wasn't just a relic of the past. It was alive, and it had been waiting for me, just like it had waited for so many others. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, its presence like a black hole, swallowing the light. And in that moment I realized with absolute clarity, I wasn't just a visitor here. I was a part of its story now. I could feel the pulse of the cemetery beneath my feet. A heartbeat that wasn't mine but was part of the land itself, echoing with a rhythm older than time. It wasn't the wind that had picked up, though the leaves on the trees rustled as if stirred by something far deeper. The figure standing in the doorway was no longer simply a shadow. It had taken form, an ethereal shifting mass that seemed to flicker like a candle flame caught in a draft. It moved, but not like a man. No, this thing had no form of its own, but rather it seemed to shape itself from the very darkness around it. Each step it took forward, the air became thicker, more oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest, forcing the very breath from my lungs. I stood frozen, unable to tear my eyes away. The figure was tall, towering over me, its presence overwhelming. It wasn't the kind of thing that belonged in the real world. It existed on the edge of reality, an apparition summoned from the very bones of this forsaken place. It didn't walk like a person, but glided, moving as though it were part of the darkness, flowing with it. And though I couldn't make out its face, I could feel its eyes on me, a burning weight that drilled into the very core of my being, making my skin crawl. My feet felt like lead. Each attempt to step backward, to break free from the hold it had on me, was met with resistance. It was as if the earth itself was clinging to me, preventing my escape, holding me captive in this cursed place. My mind screamed to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I wanted to look away, but my eyes were locked, unable to break free from the figure that loomed before me. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, swirling around me like a storm. The words were incomprehensible, like fragments of forgotten languages, old and ancient, buried deep in the earth. I couldn't understand them, but I could feel their meaning seeping into my soul. The more I tried to block them out, the stronger they became, until they were no longer whispers, but a loud, chaotic cacophony, as if the voices of the long dead were all trying to speak at once. And somewhere within that chaos, there was one voice, more distinct than the others. It wasn't a voice, though. It was a presence, a feeling, one that made my blood run cold. "Welcome," the voice inside my head spoke. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't loud. It was simply there, deep inside my mind, a cold sensation that spread throughout me. "You've come far, farther than most. Now, you must see the truth." I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The air around me grew thick, suffocating. The chapel that had once seemed so distant now felt as though it were closing in on me, its walls pressing in, its shadows stretching, reaching out to consume me. And still, the figure in the doorway didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched, its presence growing more oppressive, more malevolent with every passing second. I could feel its power, could feel it clawing at the edges of my mind, pulling me closer to some horrific truth I wasn't ready to face. A soft scraping sound echoed from the far end of the chapel, pulling my attention away from the figure in the doorway. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, more distinct. A scraping, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the stone floor. The air shifted again, becoming colder still, and I realized with a jolt that I wasn't alone. Whatever presence had filled the chapel before had now multiplied. The shadows in the corners seemed to twist and writhe, like they were alive, stretching and pulling toward the center of the room. I could see their shapes more clearly now. Tall, gaunt figures with limbs too long and faces obscured by the same darkness that seemed to cloak the whole cemetery. They were moving slowly, deliberately, as if they had all the time in the world. "Don't fight it," the voice echoed again. Not in my mind, but in the air itself, surrounding me, filling every corner of the chapel. It seemed to seep into my very soul, taking root inside me. "The cemetery calls to you just as it called to those before you. You are part of its story now. It is your fate." My heart raced, but I couldn't run. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, standing in the middle of that decaying chapel, the cold stone floor beneath me slick with the sweat that now soaked my clothes. My mind was unraveling, the weight of the words pressing in on me, smothering me. The figures in the shadows closed in, their movements slow and deliberate, their faces still hidden by the dark mist surrounding them. They seemed to be circling me, their presence growing stronger with every passing second. One of the figures in the shadows stepped forward, a pale, elongated hand emerging from the mist. It reached toward me with an almost gentle touch, but I could feel the ice cold that radiated from its fingertips, a chill that penetrated deep into my bones. I flinched back, but there was nowhere to go. The figure moved closer, its hand now hovering just inches from my face, its touch so cold that I could feel the moisture in the air freezing around it. And then, without warning, it spoke. "You belong to us now," it said, the voice rasping, dry like the crackling of dead leaves in the wind. "You're part of the story, part of the legacy. You can't leave." Domini voce. The moment the figure spoke, a flood of memories rushed to my mind. Memories of the cemetery that shouldn't exist. The words it whispered dug into me, each syllable sharpening the pain, pulling me deeper into this nightmare that was unfolding around me. My breath quickened, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what I was beginning to understand. I had been blind, only seeing the surface, but now I was staring into the abyss. The cemetery, the land, the graveyard. It wasn't just a place of rest for the dead. It was a living entity, an ancient force that had been waiting for me, drawing me closer to its inevitable grasp. I realized with a sickening certainty that this wasn't just some random occurrence. I wasn't just another lost soul wandering into the wrong place at the wrong time. No, I was part of something far greater, something much older than I could comprehend. The cemetery had been calling to me for years, perhaps my entire life. The eerie sense of déjà vu I'd experienced earlier, that feeling of having been here before. It wasn't a coincidence. I had been here before. I had always been here. The figure's hand, still hovering near my face, seemed to reach further, its fingers stretching toward me like the tendrils of some ancient plant seeking nourishment from my very essence. The cold it emanated was unbearable, seeping through my skin, turning my blood to ice. I wanted to move, to run, but every muscle in my body was frozen, paralyzed by a force greater than my own will. It was as if the air itself had thickened, becoming a wall of pressure I could neither fight nor escape. The shadows that had filled the corners of the room were now more tangible, coalescing into shapes that were undeniably human, though not quite. Their eyes gleamed, but their faces were still indistinct, like smudged ink on a forgotten page. They moved silently, their forms melding with the darkness around them, merging into the very fabric of the chapel. I could feel their presence closing in, a suffocating, invisible weight pressing in from all sides. They were everywhere, surrounding me, and with each step, they seemed to grow stronger, more solid, more real. And then, the ground beneath me trembled, a low, ominous rumble that reverberated through the chapel like the growl of some sleeping giant awakening. I staggered, fighting to keep my balance, but the tremor only deepened, as though the earth itself was shifting, aligning with the unseen forces that had taken control. I could hear the faintest sound now, like whispers from a distance, but growing, Louder, clearer, a chorus of voices chanting in unison, their words strange and alien, yet unmistakably filled with malice. They were beckoning, calling to me, urging me to join them in their eternal existence. In the darkness, something else began to take shape, something more solid, more imposing than the figures standing before me. At first, it was just a shadow, but then it grew, twisting and contorting until it formed a massive shape. It was as if the night itself had taken physical form, its edges bleeding into the darkness of the chapel, its presence overwhelming. I could feel its power now, radiating outward in waves that hit me like a physical blow. I could feel the weight of its gaze, though I dared not look up. I already knew what it was. It was the one thing that had been waiting, the force that had drawn me here. The chapel, once a place of decay and ruin, now seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The walls, the floor, the very stones beneath me, all seemed to be vibrating, alive with energy that hummed like a distant song. The figures around me shifted again, moving in a synchronized dance as if preparing for something. The very air crackled with a dark anticipation, and I knew that whatever was about to happen, it wasn't something I could stop. It was beyond me now. It had always been beyond me. I glanced back at the figure that had spoken to me, its hand, still outstretched, still so close to my face. It had no eyes, but somehow I could feel its gaze more intensely than if it were staring straight into me. The cold had spread now, filling the room, and I could no longer feel my fingers or toes. The shadows had enveloped me completely, like a shroud, and the voices that had once been whispers were now a cacophony, growing louder, their words now sharp, piercing. The land around me, the cemetery, the chapel, it was all becoming one thing, a singular force that was devouring the very essence of existence. "Don't fight it," the voice said again, not in my mind this time, but from the figure itself, as if it had moved closer, invaded my thoughts. "You're already a part of it. You were always meant to be here. We've been waiting for you." I could feel the weight of those words in my chest, as if they were pressing down on my heart, forcing the air from my lungs. I had to fight back, had to regain control, but every attempt I made to move, to speak, to even breathe, felt like it was being sucked away from me. The chapel, the cemetery, it was all merging into one singular nightmare, and I was at its center, helpless. The darkness around me deepened, consuming the light, the warmth, the very essence of who I was. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the pressure lifted. The tremors stopped. The voices fell silent. The figure in front of me stepped back, its hand lowering. For a moment, there was nothing but stillness. But that stillness was worse than any noise, worse than any sound. It was as if the calm before a storm, a brief respite before the inevitable. I knew the worst was yet to come. I could feel it. I could feel it closing in. It wasn't over. Not yet. I could feel the change in the air before I even saw it. It was subtle at first, a faint shift in the atmosphere that made my skin prickle and my stomach churn. Something was stirring, something ancient, deep in the earth beneath me, but I wasn't sure if it was the land or something even more sinister pulling at the fabric of reality itself. It was as if the world around me had bent in on itself, as though the very rules of nature were being rewritten. I tried to move, to snap myself out of the haze that had taken over my mind, but my body was paralyzed, still locked in place as if the chapel itself had imprisoned me. The darkness seemed to deepen even further, growing thicker, more suffocating. I could no longer make out the shape of the figures that had once been surrounding me. They had become part of the darkness itself, indistinguishable from the shadows. It was as if they had dissolved, leaving only their lingering presence behind, like a faint, unsettling echo that refused to fade. There was no noise now, no whispers, no chanting, only silence. But it was the worst kind of silence. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the kind of silence that came before an avalanche, before the world collapsed in on itself. Then, suddenly, a sound broke the stillness. A single, quiet step. It was followed by another, then another, growing louder. With each passing moment, I wasn't sure if it was the figure or something else approaching, but I could feel my heartbeat quicken. The step was deliberate, methodical, as if whoever or whatever was making its way toward me knew exactly how to strike terror into my soul. The sound of the footsteps echoed off the walls, bouncing around the chapel, growing louder and more insistent. It was almost as if the very floorboards were shaking with each step. And then, I saw it. In the dim light, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, unnaturally so, towering above me like a giant. Its features were indistinct, a blur of dark shapes that seemed to shift as though they couldn't quite hold their form. It moved, slowly, as if savoring each step, savoring the terror it was about to unleash. Its presence alone was enough to make the air grow cold, so cold that I could feel the breath in my lungs freeze before it even left my mouth. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was frozen, caught in its gaze. Or perhaps it wasn't even gazing at me. I couldn't tell. As it came closer, I could make out the faintest outline of something in its hand, something long and twisted, like a branch or a staff, but far too unnerving to be anything natural. It didn't belong in this world. It was ancient, worn, and covered in strange dark markings that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. The air around it seemed to warp, rippling as if it were distorting the very fabric of reality. I could feel it pulling me in, like a magnetic force I had no power to resist. It was as if my body, my very soul, was being drawn toward it against my will. The figure stopped just in front of me, so close now that I could almost feel its presence physically, a suffocating pressure that made it impossible to breathe. The staff, or whatever it was raised slightly, poised like an instrument of judgment, and I could sense the weight of its power. My heart raced. The coldness deepened, but the figure didn't speak. Instead, it simply stared. Or maybe it didn't stare at all. I wasn't sure, but I felt it in my bones, in the deepest part of my being. It wasn't just watching me, it was studying me, as if deciding my fate. In the brief silence that followed, the ground beneath me seemed to shift again, a slight tremor. But this time it wasn't just the chapel, it was everywhere. The whole cemetery, the earth itself, seemed to be waking up, stretching as if it had been dormant for eons. The graveyard was no longer just a place of death. It was a living, breathing thing, full of hunger, full of an ancient, insatiable need. I could hear something, somewhere deep in the earth, a low, rumbling growl like a beast that had been awakened from an endless slumber. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the figure stepped back. It was almost as if it had finished its inspection, as if I had passed some unseen test. The tension that had been suffocating me loosened, and for a moment, I thought I could breathe again. But there was no relief. The air was still thick with the stench of decay, of death, of something far worse than either. It was a hunger, a longing, an emptiness that threatened to swallow everything around it. The figure's retreat didn't bring safety. It brought dread, as though something much worse was about to unfold. The ground beneath my feet cracked and shifted again, and this time I didn't just feel it, I saw it. The earth was starting to tear itself open, as though the very land was being ripped apart from the inside out. The chapel around me groaned in protest, its ancient stones trembling as if they were on the verge of collapse. The walls began to crack, fissures running through the mortar, deepening with every passing second. I could see the darkness seeping through those cracks, spreading like ink through water, consuming everything in its path. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that I had no time left. Whatever had been awakened, whatever force had been pulling me toward this place was no longer a mere presence. It was real, and it was coming for me. It wasn't just the cemetery, or the chapel. It was the land itself, the world itself, bending to its will, opening up to reveal something that had been hidden for far too long. And now that it was out, there was no going back. Oh, Minnie. The earth beneath me continued to tremble, its violent shifts growing more intense with each passing moment. It felt as though the entire cemetery was alive, the soil itself waking from a long, suffocating sleep. The ground cracked open like a wound, deep fissures spreading in all directions. and I could see something moving beneath the surface, something far too vast to comprehend. I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. It was as if the very air around me had turned to molasses, thick and heavy, holding me in place. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but my legs wouldn't cooperate, paralyzed by a fear I could barely contain. The shadows around me stretched unnaturally, twisting and contorting like tendrils reaching out for me. It wasn't just the darkness. It was something older, something more ancient and primal. I could almost hear the whispers. In the air, their words unintelligible, but the tone unmistakable. It was as though the earth itself was communicating with whatever force had been unleashed. A deep, guttural voice resonating in the very bones of the land. It was an invitation, a command, a calling. And I was the one it was calling. From within, the cracks in the earth, a strange light began to emerge. It wasn't like any light I had seen before. It didn't have the warm glow of a flame, nor the cold, sterile light of the moon. It was something in between, something unsettling, almost as if the light itself was alive, pulsing in time with the beating of my heart. The more the light grew, the more I could feel the air getting colder, sharper, like the very fabric of the world was tearing apart at the seams. The shadows, the creeping tendrils, seemed to retreat in response to the light, as though they feared it. But that didn't comfort me. If anything, it made my unease grow tenfold. What was this light? And why did it feel like it was pulling me in? In that moment, I realized something. Something that I should have known all along. Something that now weighed down on me like an anvil. The cemetery wasn't just a place for the dead. It was a gateway, a door, an entrance to something beyond comprehension. And whatever had been waiting on the other side of that door was now free, unleashed, and hungry. This wasn't a mere haunting. It was a rift in the very fabric of reality, a tear between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. And it was coming for me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but there was no logic here, no reason. It was all madness, a descent into something far worse than any nightmare I could have ever imagined. And as I looked around, desperate for some form of escape, I saw them. Figures, emerging from the very earth itself. At first they were little more than silhouettes, shadows stretching and flickering in the dim light. But as they rose, I could make out their forms more clearly. They were tall, thin, and grotesque, their limbs unnaturally long, their faces twisted and hollow, devoid of any human features. Their eyes glowed faintly, like dying embers, and they moved with an eerie, jerky motion, as though they were still getting used to their bodies. The ground continued to tremble, shaking violently now, and the figures began to step forward, each one emerging from the cracks in the earth like an insect crawling from the depths of some forgotten pit. Their movements were synchronized, as though they were one entity, one single mind, with a singular purpose: to find me, to claim me. Terror surged through me again, but this time it wasn't just fear. It was a primal instinct, a surge of adrenaline that made me want to run, to fight, to do anything to escape what was coming for me. But no matter how hard I tried, my feet wouldn't move. It was as though I was rooted to the spot, a prisoner of the very earth beneath me. One of the figures reached out, its fingers elongated and sharp, like the talons of some bird of prey. I could see the dark voids of its eyes, staring into me with a hunger that went beyond mere mortal comprehension. It didn't need to speak. I could feel its intentions, its desires, radiating out from it like an aura of malice. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, my throat constricted, and I was helpless in the face of its advance. The figure's hand moved closer, the darkness around it seeming to grow more intense, more suffocating with every passing second. Then, just as it was about to reach me, the ground erupted. A deafening crack split the air, and the earth buckled beneath my feet. The cemetery, the chapel, the very land around me began to collapse, tearing itself apart as though it could no longer hold the weight of whatever had been unleashed. I was thrown backward, landing hard against the ground as the world around me descended into chaos. The figures were swallowed by the shifting earth, their screams, if they could even be called screams, echoing in the distance as they disappeared into the void below. For a moment, everything went silent. The shaking stopped. The darkness that had consumed the world seemed to recede, leaving behind only the stillness of the graveyard, now twisted and broken. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably, unsure if I was dreaming or if this was real. The air felt heavy, thick with the remnants of whatever had just occurred, and I could feel it. Something was still watching me, something still lingering in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. It wasn't over. Whatever had been unleashed had only just begun, and I knew that I was in its sights. I scrambled to my feet, my legs weak, my mind reeling. There was no escape. The cemetery, the land, the very earth around me seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it was alive, feeding off the terror that had been unleashed. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a story. This was the beginning of something far worse. The horror had only just begun, and whatever I had witnessed that night, whatever force had been unleashed, would haunt me forever. I had entered a realm where the rules of reality no longer applied, and there was no way back. I stumbled through the broken earth, the weight of fear pressing on me like a suffocating blanket. The air felt thick, as if each breath I took was a struggle, a fight against something unseen but palpably wrong. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened, what I had seen, what I had felt. The ground beneath me was still trembling slightly, as though the earth itself had not yet finished its violent convulsion. I could barely focus, my thoughts muddled with the surreal images of twisted, unnatural figures emerging from the very earth. Their grotesque forms still burned into my memory. I was disoriented, but I couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop my frantic, panicked escape. I kept my eyes on the ground, careful not to look around. Every step I took I half expected, to feel the cold, skeletal hand of one of those creatures grab me from behind, pulling me back into the depths. The night was still, eerily silent now, the sounds of the crumbling cemetery fading into an oppressive quiet. But I could feel it, the presence. It was still there, watching me, waiting for me to slip, to falter, to make a mistake. I didn't dare look over my shoulder, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up as if something was just behind me, lurking in the darkness, close enough to touch. The cemetery, now barely recognizable, was a haunting shell of what it had been. The chapel was in ruins, its once proud steeple reduced to a twisted, jagged silhouette against the night sky. Graves had been uprooted, their contents spilled across the ground, a grotesque mosaic of bones and soil. But there was something worse than the devastation itself. The feeling that the very land had been scarred, twisted, and corrupted by the horrors that had been unleashed. This place was no longer a resting place for the dead. It had become something else entirely, something far darker, a portal for forces beyond comprehension. And I had been the unwitting witness, the unfortunate soul who had stepped into this nightmare. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the air, a slight movement in my peripheral vision. But soon, it grew more pronounced. I began to hear faint whispers, voices that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath me. They weren't words I could understand, but they were unmistakably there, and they seemed to be calling to me, beckoning me deeper into the heart of the cemetery. Each step I took forward felt heavier, more reluctant, as if the earth itself was resisting my departure, as if it wanted me to stay, to be consumed by whatever dark forces had taken root in this cursed place. Suddenly I felt it, a sharp, searing pain in my chest. It wasn't physical, not exactly, but more like a pressure, a weight that pushed down on me from within. My heart began to race, erratically, and my breath became shallow. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I could feel something cold, something dark, closing in on me from all sides. It was no longer just the cemetery. The very night itself seemed to be alive, pressing in, wrapping around me like a tightening noose. My thoughts scattered, my vision blurred, and I felt myself falling into a void, a place where time and space had no meaning, where the rules of the world no longer applied. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but my voice wouldn't cooperate. The pain, the pressure, seemed to be choking me, strangling the life out of me with each passing second. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the pain stopped. The world around me shifted, the air clearing, the weight on my chest lifting. For a moment I thought I had imagined it all, that it had been some twisted dream. But the sight before me told me otherwise. The cemetery, though still shattered and broken, had begun to change. The ground itself seemed to be moving, the cracks widening, the earth groaning and shifting, as if some monstrous presence was awakening beneath the surface. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder and I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there, just the empty darkness of the cemetery, stretching out endlessly in all directions. My mind was playing tricks on me, I thought, but then the ground beneath me shook again, this time more violently. The earth cracked open with a deafening roar and I was thrown to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, terror gripping me once again as I saw the figure emerging from the depths. It wasn't one of the grotesque beings I had seen earlier. This was something else entirely. Taller, darker, more imposing. Its form was cloaked in shadows, but I could feel its presence, could sense the malice emanating from it like a black cloud. It moved with purpose, each step deliberate, each motion slow and methodical. I could hear its breath, heavy and labored, as if it was struggling to break free from whatever had bound it. And then, as if it had been waiting for me, it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It was deep, resonant, like the sound of an earthquake, the groaning of the earth itself. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, and I froze, the words seeping into my bones, filling me with a cold dread that I couldn't shake. I tried to speak, tried to run, but my legs betrayed me. I was rooted to the spot, unable to move, as if the very air had solidified around me, trapping me in place. The figure took another step, and I could see it more clearly now. Its face hidden beneath a hood of shadows, its eyes glowing with a faint, sickly light. It reached out a hand, long and twisted, and I could feel the chill emanating from it, as if its touch would freeze me from the inside out. It was too much. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to escape, but even as I thought it, I knew it was already too late. There was no escape. The figure's hand hovered just inches from my face, its fingers twisting in an unnatural, almost serpentine way. The chill radiating from it seemed to permeate my very soul, freezing the thoughts in my mind and making every fiber of my being scream for escape. But my body, no matter how much I willed it to move, remained motionless. It was as if I was paralyzed, locked in place by some ancient force that had been waiting for me. I could feel the ground beneath me tremble again, and in that moment I realized the cemetery wasn't just a resting place for the dead. It was alive, part of something far older, far darker than anything I could comprehend. The figure's voice boomed again, its words a low, guttural growl that reverberated in my chest. "You've come to awaken what was dormant." The sound of its words felt like they were coming from everywhere at once, filling the air, the earth, and even my own mind. The gravity of its meaning hit me like a punch to the gut. I had unwittingly trespassed on something ancient, something powerful, something that should never have been disturbed. The weight of that realization hit me hard, and I suddenly understood. There was no way out. This place had claimed me, body and soul. I could hear the whispers again. But this time, they were different. They were more urgent, more frantic, as if the voices were warning me, or were they begging? It was hard to tell, but the whispers swirled around me, growing louder and louder until they felt like a hurricane in my mind. And then, through the chaos of sound, I thought I heard something else, something deeper, something older, like the very voice of the earth itself speaking to me. "You are mine now." The ground beneath me cracked open further, the fissures spreading like veins through the soil, each one oozing with a dark, viscous liquid. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, and I could taste it in the back of my throat. It was overwhelming, suffocating. The cemetery was no longer just a place of death. It had become a living, breathing entity, hungry and alive, feeding off the souls of those who dared to disturb it. And now, I was its prey. I tried to fight it, to break free from the grip that held me in place, but it was hopeless. The figure took a step closer, its massive shadow swallowing me whole. I could feel the oppressive weight of its presence pressing down on me, a suffocating force that made it impossible to breathe. My heart was racing, my mind spiraling into panic, but I couldn't escape. The cemetery had me. And then, as if to reinforce that fact, I felt the ground beneath me shift again, violently this time, and I stumbled. I fell to the earth, my body finally moving of its own accord as I collapsed onto the cracked soil. My hands hit the dirt, and I felt something, slick and cold on the ground. I pulled my hands back in horror, realizing I had touched something far worse than just soil. It was the remnants of what had once been human, twisted and mummified beyond recognition. The earth itself had absorbed the souls of the dead, turning them into something else, something more sinister. And I had just become a part of that very cycle. Desperation surged through me as I pushed myself to my feet. But the figure was upon me now, its presence overwhelming. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, hear its ragged breathing as it towered over me. Its eyes glowed faintly, a sickly, unnatural light that seemed to pierce through me, searching for something. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew that whatever it was going to take it. My very soul felt as though it was being pulled from my body, and I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, like it was devouring me from the inside out. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they became a deafening roar in my ears. I wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the words wouldn't come. The force that held me in place was too strong, and all I could do was stand there, helpless, as the figure leaned closer. I could see its features more clearly now, the shadows that had once obscured its face pulling back to reveal something truly horrifying. Its eyes were dark pits, empty voids that seemed to suck in the light around them, and its skin was a patchwork of decayed flesh and bone, a grotesque mask of death. Its hand reached for me, and I felt a wave of pure terror wash over me. I tried to pull away, but it was like being trapped in quicksand. The harder I struggled, the more I sank into the earth. And then, with a sudden, horrifying realization, I understood what was happening. The cemetery wasn't just trying to claim me, it was trying to consume me. Slowly, but surely, it was taking me into its depths, making me a part of it. I had become nothing more than another lost soul, another piece of the macabre puzzle that made up this cursed place. The figure's grip tightened, and I could feel the coldness of its touch seeping into my bones. My body began to tremble uncontrollably as I felt myself slipping away. The cemetery had won. There was no escape. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was the figure's twisted, skeletal grin, a grin that seemed to promise an eternity of torment, a never-ending cycle of suffering. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long it's been since that night. Time no longer seems to matter here. All I know is that I'm still here, somewhere in the dark, lost within the graveyard's twisted embrace. The whispers never stop. They've become my constant companions, their voices now my own. And the figure? It's still watching. It's still waiting. And when it's ready, it will come for you too. If you've made it this far, then you know this story is just the beginning. But trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a spine-chilling moment. Every week, we dive deeper into the unknown, unraveling dark stories and unexplained mysteries that'll keep you up at night. And hey, if you enjoyed the terror, share this with your friends, because what's the fun in being scared alone, right? Let them experience the thrill, the suspense, and the heart-pounding moments with you. Trust me, they'll thank you later. Stay tuned for more stories, and remember, the darkness is always closer than you think. Subscribe now, and let's keep exploring the unknown together. Oh, Minnie.